I'm Shelly Palmer,
I'm Ross Martin.
and you're listening and watching Think About This.
The more you listen and watch,
The less you know.
Hi, Shelly. How are you?
I am fantastic. I like your American flag.
Thank you. I like yours too. They're slightly different. I'm sure they both have 50 stars. Did you
They
count?
do. I haven't
Okay.
counted, but yeah. No, I'm pretty sure it's a good old-fashioned American flag. And there's a good reason for that today. We got a great guest, and this is in honor of our great guest. Did you see the Fauci hearings?
I did. It's. I guess we've moved into this being a full-blown political drama, not
Yeah.
just a medical emergency.
And-
But
and
the other
you know-
thing that I think we're doing is moving from, medical emergency to political drama to now the potential for massive civil unrest. And we're beginning to see pockets of that across the country, resistance, defiance, in some cases obstruction, often actually now armed civilians who just refuse to have their freedom taken away from them and don't want to be told they have to stay at home.
And yet on the other side, Ross, there was this fascinating story in South Dakota about a tribe on tribal lands who want to have checkpoints, and the governor's saying, no, you can't have checkpoints.
Right.
They have 8 beds, no ICU beds. There are 12,000 people in the tribe on the reservation, and they know that if the virus gets there, they won't have the medical equipment they need to treat their people. And so there's that going. It's like it's both sides of this, and it's become really way more political, I think, than it should. The enemy's clearly not each other. The enemy's the virus.
So it's time to now move beyond the shallow pundits that we're seeing every day on television, repeating the news cycle, and it's sort of become a flywheel of its own, and now reach a little bit deeper to experts who know that we've actually been here before,
Many times.
and there is a playbook, literally a playbook on the shelf
Yes.
in Washington, D.C. for how to do this.
So I'm going to introduce you to a dear friend of mine, Colonel John Fenzel, retired. John has an unbelievable military career, which he will tell you a little bit about. But he's been there, he's done that, and he's got some very, very good advice for us. And let's bring him on.
John, it is great to meet you. I've heard a lot about you from Shelly, and thank you so much for your service, and much respect to you, sir.
Oh, thanks so much, Ross. It's really good to be here with you all. And I'm a huge fan of your podcast too, and I've known a decade.
How did you guys first meet? That's my question. How do you guys know each other?
I threw him out of an airplane.
As a matter of fact, you did throw me out of an airplane. That's exactly right. Jumping out of an airplane, I have to say, if you haven't done it, Ross, have you jumped out of an airplane?
No.
The greatest piece of advice I was given by Joe, who was the guy I was tethered to, because it was a tethered jump, was you're going to be scared out of your wits, but I beg you, be present for all of it, because by the time you realize you're having the greatest time of your life, it will be over. So trust me when I tell you, just go with this and you're going to love it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? He's
That's
like,
what I tell everyone when they start their job at noon. That's exactly what I say.
so he said to me, like, let's just, he said, just trust me on this. And I figured, and he said, I've done like 10,000 jumps. You're really going to live through this.
It's funny you mentioned Joe. He just retired, by the way. And I used to see him go up there. He'd tell people, relax, and I've got this. I'll take care of you up in the sky. And then he would pull out parachuting for dummies in the middle of the airplane. I'm not flying.
That with me too. Right after this speech, I was like, huh?
So, John, for those who are just meeting you for the first time, your military career was long and storied. Tell us a little bit about your time in the military and the service.
Well, I did 20 years of on active duty, and I started off as a chemical for nuclear, biological, and chemical defense, and then I ended up after about 5 years becoming a Green Beret, and I started this program. I was selected for this program called the White House Fellowship Program. It's just a really great program. It's made up of kind of about 15 to 20 mid-grade professionals, and you go through a whole selection process, and you work for a cabinet member while you're in it, and you go through this whole professional development and education program. And I didn't think that I'd be accepted, but they did, and not only did they accept me, they also accepted my brother into this program as well. So I started off with the Office of Personnel Management, and then you had the election where President Bush took over for President Clinton, and at that point I became responsible for the transition of OPM, and then I moved over to the Vice President's office, and that was when you had the energy crisis, if you remember that. And so they asked me where I wanted to work. I said, well, you really ought to just put me where you need somebody the most. And that was this energy task force that they were creating. And, it was tremendous. I didn't know a thing about energy except, how to turn the lights on. Yeah. But I learned, and over time we developed the nation's first energy policy. And it was, and as we published that, the next step was, they were creating a Homeland Defense Task Force. And they said, well, since you know about these Homeland Defense Task Force, why not become the staff director for that? And so I did. And then right after that, that's when 9/11 happened. And then went on back, into the regular Army after that.
So tell us a little bit, if you will, your take on what's happening right now.
As I mentioned to you, I was a chemical officer, and as a chemical officer, you are responsible for three dimensions of warfare, and that's nuclear warfare, chemical warfare, and biological warfare. And so I studied this whole dynamic of biological warfare for about 5 years before I came into Special Forces, before I came a Green Beret. And, all of these things, it's almost like, I always wondered why they made me a chemical officer, because the only class I'd ever failed in my entire academic career was chemistry. So, but during that time, I learned an awful lot about viruses and vectors and biological occurrences. And so here we are in the middle of this. And of course, none of us ever thought that we would be here in the middle of it. But, this is it's not the first pandemic of our lifetimes, but it's the most serious one. And, as I look at this, it's almost kind of like looking at a train coming down the middle of the tunnel. You can see that light, you can kind of understand what's happening. And I think that this is going to have obviously long-term ramifications on every dimension of our society, every part of our life. And so nobody knows. Nobody has a crystal ball for any of this. And if anybody says they have all the answers, they're not telling the truth, because nobody knows exactly how this is going to turn out. But we're pretty fortunate in that we have history to be able to go back on and look at past pandemics. The most serious one was, of course, was 102 years ago, and that was the pandemic influenza of 1918, and that lasted for about 2 years overall. In fact, I'm reading this book now called The Great Influenza by John Barry, and it's excellent. I'd commend it to anybody just to get a kind of a good view of how these pandemics work, and every one is different.
We've all grown up feeling like a basic sense of security because we're Americans, right? So no matter what, if everything fell apart, we would be defended by our government, by our military, and in this case, what is so terrifying is we feel defenseless. What are we supposed to do now? And everybody we're counting on to defend us, to understand the threat, to scenario plan, to prepare, to respond, doesn't seem to be happening the way you would normally expect it to. I don't know. There's no normal, but I'm a civilian. Like, am I wrong?
No, you're exactly right, and that's one of the things that happen in mass pandemics like this. Whether it was the Spanish flu or whether it's coronavirus today. Or smallpox or any cholera, any of these, they all kind of tear at the fabric of our society and trust between society and government. And and the minute you start losing trust with our government officials, and that's not just at the federal level, by the way, it's also at the state and local. That's when you start seeing things kind of come apart at the seams. And right now, I think that we're kind of at that edge, and and unless we start kind of bringing things back together and reestablishing trust, then the consequences, I think, are going to be pretty serious.
So, John, you and I spoke last week about things that should have been done, and I don't want to rehash that. And also, what should have been done, it doesn't matter now because it wasn't done. What should the military be doing right now? What should we expect from the military?
The military, Shelly, it's a great question. The military has its hands full right now. They're responsible for the security of our country, but then also internally, they have a mission as well, and that's typically where you see the National Guard at the state level being responsible for everything from ensuring that the continuity of our supply system is intact to, if it came down to it, instituting population control measures. And we haven't come to that point yet, but at the end of the day, it's really the military has its own defined missions, and they can either work for a state governor if they're the National Guard, or if they're on active duty, if they're Title X forces. At that point, they are responsible for our external security. And when you ask that question, the first thing that comes to mind for me are all the exercises that we've done in the past. And when you start looking at biological warfare exercises, for instance, what comes along with a virus is also a scenario where another nation is trying to take advantage of that situation, or they've instituted the virus, or it might be a terrorist attack that they have to deal with. But there are really defined responsibilities that our military has, and that's where they are in those defined lanes.
I know that the Army is not allowed to operate on American soil. There's a statute about that. But I asked a different military officer friend of mine if an adversary were rolling tanks down Fifth Avenue, our military would be fighting in Midtown Manhattan to defend us. True or false?
Well, it's true, and it would happen. Everything would happen very quickly, and your first line of defense would be your National Guard, and then very quickly after an amendment was signed by Congress. At that point, our Title X, our active duty forces would then step in as well. So absolutely.
To that point, coronavirus is an enemy. It's global. It's clearly external. How is it that the military has not been activated on American soil to protect us and help us?
Because things haven't gotten that serious yet. And it might, as serious as it seems right now, you don't have mass rioting in the streets, and you don't have all of the civil unrest that would define a much more serious situation. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that we could easily get there. Now, we've talked about this, Shelly. One of the things that I've always said is that, we're fighting an enemy, and it's the virus. It's not each other. And, and it's very easy in environments like this, in health crises like this, for people to start fighting amongst themselves, fighting their governments, and it happens when you lose that level of trust, and so we haven't gotten there yet, but it's definitely kind of fraying at the edges, and if there is a resurgence, my concern is that come October, November, December, if the mortality rate increases once again, and hospitals become overwhelmed, if our supply chain and the food supply is threatened, at that point, then we could get there. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. And it's not just John Fenzel saying this, by the way. These are things that have happened in the past, but also have been actively exercised at the White House and with Congress and across academia as well.
It looks like this weekend we crossed into the mode of defiance. We are watching people defy local government, state government orders, congregating en masse, walking the streets of Santa Monica in crowds, throwing dinner parties in New York City and in the Hamptons, and then in some cases actually rioting against the government who wants them to stay indoors. and put on masks, we could be days away from the scenario you're talking about. We could be hours away, one incident away from civil unrest. And frankly, I can't. Shelly and I have talked about this on the show, and a lot of our listeners have been DMing us and texting us about this issue. It doesn't feel like we're very far away from, oh, we better call in the military, because the biggest threat is no longer the virus, it's other human beings who've got the mind virus.
I think it comes down to a couple of things. First of all, if you look at our history with epidemics and with pandemics, the one thing that has always worked in the past that I don't think that we're doing a good job of right now at many levels is just educating the public and trusting the public as well. Now, that's a big stretch, obviously, but I think with education comes trust. And if you have governmental entities that are intent on issuing executive orders at every point, at that point, people are going to start, saying, my rights are being violated, and when they're really not, their rights are not being violated. If you look at the Constitution, it's all in there. The quarantines, the population control measures, everything covered by the Constitution, everything from the preamble to the Bill of Rights to the 10th Amendment, everything, it's all in there. But if you don't educate the public, and if you don't trust the public to understand, that's when they're going to start making some pretty significant leaps in the wrong direction.
So, John, you mentioned something that I made me think of another time. Talk to me about Operation Dark Winter.
It was right after 9/11, and with this Homeland Defense Task Force that we had just created, at that point, they said, we're going to bring in Governor Ridge, and we're going to be creating an Office of Homeland Security. But very quickly, this whole group came in to brief on this exercise. It was called Dark Winter, and it was actually conducted in, I think it was June of 2001, and then probably, I want to say, October of they briefed the vice president. And of course, he was a very intent listener, because one of the threats that we knew that we were facing were these nuclear and biological threats that came right after the attacks of 9/11, and since this exercise has become kind of legendary in all of the different exercises that have been done, and it was really the precursor for a lot of other biological warfare exercises. But you had key players. I think it was Sam Nunn that was playing the president of the United States, and you had David Gergen that was acting as the national security advisor, and let me see. James Woolsey, I think, was the director of Central Intelligence, and then Frank Wisner was the Secretary of State. So that's how serious the players were, and this went on for several days. But when you look at this, it really talked about all the stressors that happen when a society is facing a rampant virus, a pandemic. And in this case, it was a terrorist attack, and it hit the town of Oklahoma City, and it quickly spread to, I think, to 25 other states. And the virus was smallpox. And of course, we haven't seen smallpox, I think, since 1947. And right at the first sign of smallpox, New York City suddenly received 500,000 immunizations overnight, and I want to say 6 million immunizations over just a couple of weeks. But this was the scenario that was introduced, and when you look at the effects of that virus and all the actions that happened as a result, you saw all the stressors, and it bears this kind of eerie resemblance to what we're seeing today. It didn't go, we haven't gone as far as that, but, you saw leaders that were really hampered by the inability to address the crisis that they hadn't foreseen. There was a massive health crisis. You had difficulty in predicting what citizens would do. You asked them to go into quarantine, and after a period of time, they violated the quarantine. So you had a whole host of different things. But on top of that you had what we had just been talking about, the issue of the National Guard. Martial law was introduced. It was a scary exercise, and right after that, the vice president gave the directive to increase the production of vaccines for smallpox, to all the way up to like 6 million on hand. And so it was kind of a seminal exercises. And from that, you had a whole host of other exercises that have come about. In fact, the last one was an event called, or an exercise called Event 201. It was basically an exercise that forecasted the economic troubles of a pandemic.
So the government has been gaming this and scenario planning this for years.
Yes.
Nothing is new here. So where's the playbook?
Well, we had a playbook, and right. The playbook is on a shelf, gathering some dust. And during the Bush 43 administration, we had actually developed a pandemic policy, and that policy was for the flu, for a pandemic flu. But if we had prepared and done all the different steps of that policy, we wouldn't be where we are right now. And so, plans are great, but if you don't implement them, then they're pretty useless.
John, you used to work for the vice president.
Yes.
Now we have a new vice president, Pence. If he were here right now, and I'm sure he would love to be on our podcast. We haven't been able to find the time. But if he were here on the podcast, John, what would you say to the vice president?
I would say educate, educate, educate. Train and educate, and if you do that, and if you take this virus seriously, and if you look back at all the lessons of history, you will automatically reduce all the hysteria. People will understand where the government is coming from. They'll trust the government. But if you try to kind of order your way out of this and issue directives solely. The media is going to overreact. The people are going to overreact, and that's where we are right now. So, in a nutshell, that's what I would tell them. And I think that that's one area that we could really improve upon, because my greatest fear right now, Ross, is that we go down this road and we start opening up too early. In about 150 days to 200 days, you're going to see this massive spike, and we're going to lose all of the gains that we've gathered over the past 3 months. And you see it time after time. By the way, just reading John Barry's book, the Great Influenza, it's exactly what happened. You had the most of the incidents of the flu and the deaths and the fatalities come up right around October. And then by November, December, we started going back to normal. It was too soon, and then you had another spike. Well, this influenza went on for another 2 years, and if you look at countries like New Zealand, for instance, they instituted very, very quick and decisive restrictions, and they stuck to them. And as a result, their incidence and infection rate within New Zealand, within their country, is extremely minimal compared to any other country.
I don't think it's lost on anybody that this has become politicized beyond anyone's wildest dreams. I heard the other day that if you are in certain places and you're wearing a mask, you are declaring that you're a liberal, and if you're not, you're declaring you're a conservative. And I mean, if you have a red and a blue point of view on personal health and personal safety, we've taken this way too far. John, you train people to be leaders. You are one of the most storied military leaders of your generation. If you were going to give advice to people who are leading companies, leading families, leading states, I know what you tell the vice president, but what would you tell someone who's in a position to lead right now?
The thing about all of these is that these pandemics they happen. They're rare occurrences, but in a crisis, you first have to meet people, whether they're people in your office or whether they're part of your citizenry. You have to meet people where they are, and if you the first thing that people need to do in all cases is to feel safe. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what's at the very bottom? It's safety, because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to be able to talk to people about different measures that they have to take while they're off buying hand sanitizer and toilet paper, right? It's if they're worried about themselves first, and so once you understand that, then you'll have kind of a launching point to be able to address everything else. You have to be able to anticipate all the different aftershocks. There's, in all the second and third order effects of that happen, to the system, and every system that we have within our country and really globally has been affected by this. Every single one of us, in some way, shape, or form, has been affected. So, it gets to the point where you have to first of all seek to understand what people are going through and understand what they're doing, and that really establishes the level of trust. And then you have to educate. But leaders really do kind of empower around a common purpose, and until you establish that common purpose, you're not going to really be able to talk about anything else, at least that people are going to listen to. And I think that we're still there at that first step. What is our common purpose? Because we're not really talking so much about defeating the virus. We're talking about going back to normalcy. And things aren't going to be normal for an awfully long time, at least the way that we've always interpreted normalcy.
John Fenzel, I can't thank you enough. Words of wisdom for everybody. If we only understood that the common purpose was to defeat the virus and everything would come from that, it would be a much, much better world right this moment.
John, thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, it's good to be with you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
So Ross, that was Colonel John Fenzel, retired. And you know why I talk about him with like love and adoration now.
Yeah.
He's the real deal. And it was good to hear from somebody who doesn't have like a political dog in the hunt and is just purely an American, which is why we have our American flags. But I mean, I'm so sick of Republicans and Democrats who hate each other more than they love America. I want everyone to love America right now. And I want people to be Americans. I don't want.
It's right. And the two things he did that I found were just so powerful and succinct and simple. One, remind everyone that there actually is a plan and it's on the shelf in DC. If someone would please just go get that plan, because John co-wrote it, right? So there actually is a playbook for what to do when you're in a pandemic, and we need to actually get it.
Yes.
The other thing is he talked about how important it is for us to stop worrying about getting back to normal and just focus all of our energy and attention, all of our resources on fighting the enemy, which is this virus, not each other.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I don't know if we can say it better than that. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And this is, video is new, but we're enjoying doing this on video. But most importantly, we're enjoying the fact that all of you are watching and you're writing to us and you're talking to us. And I know everybody is sheltering in place and is sequestering. And I know we're getting ready to open back up the world. But I hope we do it safely and I hope we do it responsibly. And I know if you're watching this, you're probably on the safe and responsible side. So thank you for that. And reach out to us because we want to hear from you.
Peace.